Welcome to the Anthro to UX podcast, where you will learn how to break into UX with an anthropology degree. Through conversations with leading anthropologists working in user experience, you will learn firsthand how others made the transition, what they learned along the way, and what they would do differently. We will be discussing what it means to do UX research from a practical perspective and what you need to do to prepare a resume and portfolio. I'm your host, Matt Artz, a business anthropologist specializing in design anthropology and working at the intersection of product management, user experience, and business strategy. Let's get started. Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm here today with Jay Hasbrouck, and Jay is a Pathfinder at Facebook working on the new product experimentation team. Previously at a number of great companies. Also, you were previously a partner at Ethnoworks, founder at Filament Insights Innovation, as senior human factor specialist at IDEO, research scientist at Intel, and of course, as many people will know, the author of Ethnographic Thinking from Method to Mindset. So Jay, I do want you to kind of give a little background on how you came into anthropology, but I'm going to sort of tee that off by saying that when looking at your history, I see that you started in policy and management at Carnegie Mellon before going on to get your PhD from the University of Southern California in social anthropology. So I'm particularly curious, of why you made the change along the way and what kind of helped you realize that anthropology was, the profession for you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Matt. I really appreciate the time to sit and chat. I think I have to say that one of the biggest catalyst for me to move into anthropology was a professor, Professor Judith Modell. She has since married. Her last name is now Schachter, at Carnegie Mellon. And she taught a number of courses that I took just because I needed to fill some credits. And one of them was in visual anthropology. And it was really, really inspiring. And it was small group seminars, and you really got to engage with the material. And it was the first time I think I'd ever really engaged with anthropology. I don't remember ever having exposure to it in high school. And she was just a really gifted facilitator and teacher, and truly inspiring in lots of ways. So I didn't end up majoring in anthropology because at the time, Carnegie Mellon didn't have a major in anthropology. But that is what inspired me to move on. I spent a little time working after undergrad in public relations and environmental policy in particular, and wasn't finding it very fulfilling. So I started thinking back to what I really loved about what I'd had exposure to in my past, and it just kept coming back to anthropology. So that's what primarily what led to the shift.
Got it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think on the way to the PhD, your master's was in visual anthropology.
That's right. Yeah. I think in large part inspired by Judith's course, and really thinking about how I might combine creativity and thinking about cultures, and also just learning a new language, which is a really critical part of visual anthropology. Is not only producing a visual deliverable, but thinking about what visuals mean in people's lives. Developing an understanding of what that looks like, and how to both interpret it and then also use it as a form of expression, which was really something very exciting to me. So I finished that degree, and then decided that I'd completed a lot of the coursework and wanted to continue expanding my thinking in anthropology. So all told, it was a 10-year ride, which apparently is common. I've heard in cultural and social anthropology. It's a long run, but I'm really grateful for that experience there.
Great. So I think you're the first person on this particular podcast of mine that is a visual anthropologist. So, I don't want to jump ahead too much into your career, but I'd be curious, have you continued to use, visual anthropology as a means to document? Is that very present throughout all of your work?
Yeah, it is. I place a high value on visuals as a form of data, both still images and video imagery. I really think there's a lot of data there, a lot of really rich ways to understand cultures and understand people that we kind of lose sight of when we get trapped in words. And I think that happens a lot. I think you see that to a great extent. A lot of cultural anthropologists really, I think, rely too heavily in some ways on the spoken language as the only way to understand a culture. So I have leaned quite heavily on that. And I like to also play with visuals on the deliverable side as well, and think about how can we help people understand where we're going and the insights that we have in a way that's more compelling and more immersive. And visuals are often a fast forward way to do that.
Mm-hmm. And in your experience, do you find that presenting the data in that way, in any particular way, visually is better? Is video almost always better than, say, just still images? Like, is it completely contextual?
It's totally contextual. I think I've seen video bomb. I think they're without context and without the interpretive value that we bring to it as practitioners. It could really just be, it could come close to meaningless, and I've seen that happen. So I think it really depends on your audience. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about exactly that, tailoring the kinds of deliverables we have as researchers into kind of buckets, and thinking about, when you're working with a team, I'll just throw out a couple of examples. So when you're working with a team that's maybe midstream and they're moving fast, you're probably much more likely to get benefit from the kinds of deliverables that are more like headlines. Really just sort of like, I'm just trying to steer the ship, move it slightly one way or another at this point. Mm-hmm. But in contrast, if you've got a group you're working with that's really on the front end of developing whatever product or service that they are, in that case, I think you have a lot more room to do the kinds of exploratory deliverables where you might bring in a lot more video. You might bring in, clips and stills and different kinds of explorations, and let people become inspired by what it is you're trying to offer. Mm-hmm. So there are other things in between as well that I've been working on, but I think those two ends of the spectrum are good ways of thinking about how we're communicating clearly and inspiring the people that we want to reach.
How about, and maybe, this is kind of related, but I guess you could say it's sort of slightly outside of visual anthropology, but how about audio alone? Do you find that there is a place for just audio?
I actually do. One of the deliverables that I'm working on right now, in fact, I'll be recording some stuff later today, is a 3-part podcast for deliverable on a project focusing on community development and cohort formation. So that we're taking, it's a bit of a bold step. But one of the ways that we're positioning, I think hopefully will be appealing, is that it's a chance to step away from the computer, step away from any screen, get out and take a walk, and think about something that's stimulating and relevant to what you're doing, but doesn't require your 100% attention. So we're trying to make it pretty lightweight. It's basically each episode has like 3 themes that we hit.
Got it. And is that for internal teams then?
Yep.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Pretty cool way to kind of help bring them into the insights without being kind of too heavy, right? It is, put it on, go to the gym. It's definitely a nice way to approach it. Yeah, I would be curious to see how that turns out. So to fast forward a bit, kind of away from the visual anthropology piece. So, your career you've gone through a number of leading companies, Intel, IDEO. And so, at IDEO, with a title of human factor specialist, it does sound like that's a little bit more kind of blocking and tackling, a little bit more evaluative than, pathfinding at Facebook. Was that the case, or was it still more kind of on the generative discovery side?
It was very much on the generative discovery side. I think that's just the title they had for all of us, people who were, researchers at the time. And I think it comes from, some of that is a legacy from how design has originally thought about research, which has been, is it a fit? Can we find the fit? But all the projects that I worked on there were mostly 0 to 1 projects. I shouldn't say all, most of them were 0 to 1 projects, looking at the future of selling, the future of energy conservation. So most of them were those big sort of meaty problems that we had, in some cases, had like 3 or 4 researchers on a team tackling these big issues.
Got it. So, I think this doesn't apply to everybody, but a lot of people I talk to really do aspire to sort of be much more in that generative discovery space. I think many people find it fun to be at that fuzzy front end and innovating and really defining the problem space before even coming up with solutions. And you seem to more or less have been there from the beginning of your career. And so that's kind of a unique opportunity for you, but it's also not easy to pull off. So how did you manage to kind of, make your way from a PhD into that type of work?
Yeah, I think I really kind of stumbled into it in a lot of ways. I was teaching at Cal Arts at the time, and I was sort of thinking about what was next, where I would go, and I wasn't sure teaching was the way or was the path that was made the most sense for me. And then I somehow came across a listing for a position at Intel, and that was the first group I think that was embedded within a product group. Up until then, they had a people and practices group that was mostly about, it's more think tank, basically. Mm-hmm. So I was part of an initial group, and there was another sort of a parallel group called the digital health group, and we were focused in those spaces on the home team and the health team. And because of the way that, just the nature of silicon in general, our timelines were out. They were years out. We needed to understand where was technology going to be in the home in 5 years, for example. And where was it going to be in places where there was an emerging middle class that was going to start buying some of these products in 5 years? So I think in that sense, I don't think I headed toward it intentionally, but I ended up there. And it was a great experience. At Intel, I learned so much obviously about technology, but also just about how to relate to a cross-functional team. It's filled with challenges, and none of those challenges are gone. I think many researchers continue to struggle with those, but thinking about strategies to meet them where they are, to actually think of them in many ways as an ethnographic culture. An ethnographic project, a culture in and of themselves, the cross-functional team, and dig deep into their values and their reward structures and their priorities and their behaviors so that you can really understand where they're coming from. Their heads aren't in our space the way we might assume. I think it was short version of that is I pretty much stumbled into that at Intel, and it felt like a natural fit.
So, you just said it felt like a natural fit, which is great because other people obviously have like some issues with getting accustomed to the pace, although your pace again was probably a little bit longer given silicon. But nonetheless, a lot of people do have some challenges when making that change. But there is the opportunity to really be researching. I think, when you were speaking with Keith Kellerson, you said sort of like the ethnography of everything. And so I'm curious to know, were you doing that on your own, or were you also, were you just tasked with sort of more like business anthropology in the design space, or were you also brought in to think about it from an organizational perspective, or did you just sort of, bring that into the process based on your training?
Yeah, I would say we weren't brought in to do that, and I think one of the kind of light bulbs that went off for some members of our team was the failures that we had. We would come back from the field with a set of insights and a prioritized set of experiences we know the users want, and then try to translate those into feature sets and hit a brick wall, right? Because we weren't speaking the same language as the dev team in one way or another, and we were in many cases either we were off target basically in terms of maybe the number of features that could even be embedded within a chip, because we didn't have that technical knowledge. So I think over time, it was really just a lot more listening, a lot more thinking about where they're coming from, what capabilities are, and trying to do a little bit more of that matchmaking. And then bringing in folks that could do some of the more sort of ergonomic issues, or some of the more the sort of the bridge between research and engineering. We had a few folks that we brought in to help do that as well. And that, I think, went a long way to translate where we were trying to go with our insights. So I'd say, yeah, it was an uphill battle for a while, and we were a new team. We were a new set of research, a different kind of research. So I think we learned the hard way more than anything. So
aside from listening and arguably learning the language of the other disciplines, whether it be engineering, business, whatever it may be, do you have any suggestions for people who are new to these kind of roles and how they can kind of quickly acquaint themselves and really be a successful collaborator in an embedded model?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, as you mentioned, listening, understanding where they're coming from. I think getting a deep technical understanding is really beneficial. I mean, you don't need to be able to code, but I think if you get a good understanding of how long certain types of whatever it is if it's hardware, it's another thing, but if it's software, how long might it take to build, a certain set of experiences, gives you a stronger ground to stand on. So I think that's all useful. But I think in addition to that, really trying to understand, as far as the organization goes, to be able to back up and zoom out to 10,000 feet and say, if this is successful and we can move it forward, where does it fit within the larger constellation of offerings? Where does it fit within the consumer perspective of the brand and or the technology itself? Having that broad lens and being able to zoom in and zoom out like that is actually pretty unique to ethnography and anthropology. Mm-hmm. And that skill is really appreciated if you can communicate it clearly. So I would say really try to exercise that muscle, or try to think about, is this a time where I should step back? So can I, when do we zoom out, and what additional insight am I offering here? I think those things go a long way.
Now, when zooming out, sometimes we can get very broad, in anthropology as a discipline has a little challenge with this. Sometimes we can kind of get a little broad to the point where, it seems like people could tune out maybe, right, in the business world. And so how do you personally balance, bringing some broader concepts into, a business meeting and translating them in a way that the rest of the team can sort of make sense of without seeming, like you are being overly academic?
Yeah, it's a great point, Matt. I think you're spot on in terms of that being a challenge. I've learned a lot about storytelling over the years, and I think that at the end of the day, that's what we're doing. We're telling a story each time, and that actually works to our advantage. People learn through metaphor, as Mary Catherine Basin would say, and I think that's good. And we understand metaphor really well. Not only is it a form of data that we often use with our participants, but it's also something that we should be well versed in as we're delivering our insights. So in that sense, I'm very careful to think about where I use theory and how it's timed. I think it's really important to start your deliverable with something that's completely and directly relevant to your audience, thinking about where they're coming from so that something resonates right away. And I think it's perfectly okay to open up big questions. It's like, say, the big what ifs and things like that. That actually stimulates interest and gets people, involved. But the way you answer them needs to be, something that follows their line of thinking. It shouldn't jump right to theory from there. So I've very judiciously used theory. Like most recently, I've used rites of passage as a way to think about community cohort formation. And that was actually a really interesting tool for a lot of people, but in small doses, just enough to understand the basics so that they can translate it to their own work.
Is it safe to say, to some degree, like you use like the kind of journalistic, almost like inverted pyramid model? Like you start with the findings, like that will capture them, and then kind of go broader?
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases that's true. I think there are different mindsets that you're aiming toward. I think in some cases it depends on, like I said before, where the team is. Some cases all you're going to get is the headline, right? Mm-hmm. But in some other cases where you really want to dig in and you do have a bit of an argument that you're developing because maybe through the course of 3 studies you're starting to see patterns, and you have some unique interpreted value to offer. In that case, you're almost, you're following the journalistic model and the deliverable, but you're also acting a bit like an attorney. You're building a case, right? You're stacking ideas so that at the end they follow your rationale and they come to the same realization that you had. That's the ultimate goal, I think, in many cases, to internalize the insights that you reached. It's not easy, but I think that there's some ways to get there through narrative in particular, and making sure you're touching them. Three principles of storytelling that I love to follow that I think are really useful. This was specific to a project I worked on around online storytelling, but I think they transfer pretty broadly, and that is authenticity, emotion, and interaction between the storyteller and the audience. Those 3 things really go a long way. If you can find places within your deliverables to touch people in those ways.
Yeah, sure. And you see it today, in creators on any of the social platforms that excel. It very much touches on all of them. Right. So storytelling is also important really in selling yourself selling a business if you've started one, and you did start one. So you went on, started Filament Insight and Innovation, did that for many years. And so, that leaving corporate and choosing to start your own business is interesting in its own right, and has obviously, some opportunities and challenges, which I want to ask about. But I also kind of want to then get into, what did you do to kind of grow it? How did you position the services you've offered to really help people understand that you're providing value? And so to kind of go back from the start, maybe you want to just say a little bit about why you chose to leave corporate and be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I loved IDEO. It was a great place to be, and I learned a ton there. But I had a client that came to me and said, we're starting this giant innovation initiative within a large healthcare company, and we need someone to help shepherd that process. So it was an opportunity to start my own business with an anchor client. And it was, I figured I won't have this opportunity again, probably. So I figured I'd jump and try it. I have pretty high tolerance for risk as a person. So I was like, what the hell? And it was great. It was a fantastic experience. But that was primarily what, it was circumstance in some ways. And also, a bit of an entrepreneurial bend. The very first thing I did when I finished that job with the environmental policy consultancy in DC, they had a news clipping service, and it was a traditional, literal news clippings. They would, with scissors, cut newspaper articles out of the newspaper and send them to you based on the topics that you wanted. And I realized at that time that, there's this whole other side of the world called the internet where people are actually, exchanging information. And so I started something called Cyberscan. So I had a bit of understanding of, I like to play in that sort of entrepreneurial space. Cyberscan eventually got pushed out of business by Google Alerts, as you might imagine. There are a lot of ways to find information and track information online. So what I'm getting at is it didn't feel too far afield for me to start my own company and go into consulting. And I think my particular take was, sort of innovation, but with that deep understanding of the kind of cultural context that we need to be able to innovate strategically. I think there are design firms out there that do it, but the focus for Filament was primarily that lens.
So, of course, IDEO had already been, David Kelly had already been on TED. Human-centered design was popular. People, HBR was writing articles. People were starting to kind of, in a more mass audience, were starting to kind of get a sense of this kind of work. But it was still, it's not like you're going to walk into every business and they're going to get what you did. So aside from your anchor client, which you were obviously very lucky to have that opportunity, were people getting what you were selling after that?
I think so. There were times when we would, when I say we, I would always partner with folks. I rarely ever worked alone. I think it's almost impossible to do what we do alone, to be honest. I think it is a collaborative, and you get just so much better deliverable and better experience when you're working with others. But I think that we would run into clients from time to time that really kind of, I think that they were expecting market research. And instead of understanding the deeper insight that we were bringing to the table. And so eventually I put together a slide that was like market research on one column, ethnographic research on the other column. Here's the difference, right? And we're not here to, we're here to understand deeply rather than understand broadly. There are all these, it goes through each of the stages. And that did help, I think. And then the other challenge, I think, for many people is that our analysis process is often a huge black box for folks. The way we identify patterns and then move from patterns to themes and then eventually to insight. It's really tricky if someone's coming from a very quantitative focused background. And a lot of people who hire researchers from large companies do have that background or have an MBA in X. So yeah, that was, I think those two things were tough. And I think what I've done and what's been really useful in terms of helping people understand how we get to our insights, our final, where we land, is to help work backward, right? So start with the insights and say, okay, here are the set of recommendations, and here are the insights that we have as a team based on our informed perspective. They arose from this cluster of themes that was built from these patterns we saw across all of these observations across our field work. And by tracing that backward, people were like, okay, now they may not be able to reproduce it, but they get that it's systematic, and that there is a rational, logical way that we got to where we did.
Got it. So, building on that, I don't want to jump ahead to Facebook too much. However, you said something that I'm curious to ask a question about. So, obviously Facebook historically is known for its engineering culture, move fast, break things, that all that, the sort of the mythology sort of around that grew up around it, classic, a founder who's an engineer, right? So, I would presume that there is, a preference in many places within the organization for quant data, but I could be wrong. But so, have you found any way to best sell qualitative data to an audience that is, aside from the sort of working backwards, like, is there anything else that you have found that really helps a quant audience understand what you're doing? And maybe say, see the value of it when the end value is not huge?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you might assume, yes, that Facebook has this sort of quant-leaning culture, but in many ways, there's a lot of receptivity for qual, and I think they're very smartly organized as an organization to be able to understand what that balance should look like and when we should lean on which. As you might imagine, there's a great deal of emphasis placed on metrics. And we have a huge data science team, which is not the same as quantitative research, but there's it's along that line. So I think some of our product managers and other leaders, I think they are pretty good at knowing when do we need to ask a question and when can we pull from the data we have to get a better and more granular understanding. Mm-hmm. But there's a ton of one of the benefits, I think, of being part of a social media giant or being part of any social media company is that many of the leaders also realize that emotion plays a huge part of how people interact with these platforms, and community, in interaction and engagement. And they understand also that those things aren't going to come from metrics entirely, and that we need to understand, especially if we want to understand what's next, we need to understand people at a pretty deep level. So they get that. And then I would say in terms of tools that I've found really effective at Facebook, I've been really and personally interested in many ways in thinking about the sort of historic and evolutionary perspective on where we are and where we're going. So looking toward the future, I think in many ways is about looking at the past and thinking about what kinds of human behaviors have been compelling, and what kinds of ways are they present currently, and what does that tell us about the range of possibilities in the future? That kind of people can understand that, I think, and even if they're not an anthropologist, they get that evolution is part of who we are. So this oftentimes leans on things like evolutionary biology and neurology and other disciplines that can help inform and back up some of what it is that we're offering as qualitative researchers. That has been pretty effective.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd like to come back to the range of possibilities, but just to kind of build a bridge between what you were doing in your own, as an entrepreneur and Facebook. So, in a lot of your work, whether that's, some talks or, writing, you seem to have an interest in strategy. And strategy is one of those things that I've been asking about it recently on the podcast, because it's one of those things that it seems to come up that everybody has sort of a different take on it. But obviously, if you started your own business and you want to be sustainable within that space, you need to have your own business strategy. And of course, we can contribute to the strategy of our clients. So how did you look, I'm curious to know how you looked at positioning. So I'm going to tie this to your book. So, you generally refer to everything as ethnographic, ethnographer, as opposed to anthropologist or anthropology. And so I'm curious to know, is that sort of key to your own positioning of what you do and how you framed out the business, and maybe why you chose one over the other?
Yeah, I mean, I would say personally, I certainly identify as an anthropologist, but I think that the tool of ethnography has broader more people know about it, and it has it's easier to access, I think, for folks. They kind of get it's not as sort of laden with as much of the history and some of the things that are more difficult for people to understand that anthropology has. I think when we're talking about a broad audience, that is. So I think it's very accessible, and I actually believe that there are a lot of other people in other disciplines that can practice ethnography very effectively, and so it doesn't need to be an anthropologist who does it. So I wanted to aim toward accessibility and the kind of insights that can be easily integrated, and I felt like ethnography could go there more easily as a concept or as a praxis. Can achieve that more successfully than talking about something that's so big like anthropology. And as you know, that word carries with it, all kinds of assumptions about, archaeology and, like linguistics and, there's physical anthropology. So I think it's easier to tighten it a little bit. And I found that was the case. And it also, I think, is easier to translate some of that to strategy, as you mentioned. I think that was my strategy, yes, certainly in the book. But I think also a lot of the findings that come from ethnographic investigation in particular, they're really suited toward application in a lot of ways. So it isn't necessary, as it might often be in anthropology, to have extreme longitudinal investigations, for example, or what I would call them extreme. Too many they may not be, but
Sure.
like a 5-year investigation of a culture. That's no one has the patience for that in the applied world.
Yeah. So I'm with you there. But what I think is interesting about strategy, to bring that back, is that I oftentimes when I'm talking to people, I feel like what I'm hearing is that the insights lead to a set of decisions that produce something. But for me, when thinking of strategy, I am much more concerned with long-term, sustainable competitive advantage, which seems like in many ways it would relate to your current role in terms of pathfinding for new product experimentation. Instead of just, here's my insights, we're producing deliverable, an insight that's going to inform a deliverable that is helpful for some short period of time. I mean, I really want to look at how can we protect our position over a long period of time. Some of that may relate to, intellectual property that obviously can't be replicated for given, for such reasons, or, another position in the market that is just, so disruptive that it's difficult to ramp up too quickly. Even if not maybe necessarily protected by intellectual property. And so, I'm generally looking at it from, again, the sustainable competitive advantage perspective. And so when you think of strategy, how does that relate to you? Does that resonate at all or,
Yeah, I think it does. And I think one of the things that happens with when what you produce is almost always aimed in the strategy space and not as much in the product space, which is, there's a mix in terms of pathfinding, of course. I do tend to then lean more on anthropology, right? So start thinking about some of those longitudinal questions. So I think it's a combination. For example, my methods now, some of it is user research or ethnographic research, but there are a lot of other different components, I would say, that are part of contributing to developing a strategic POV. So, like I mentioned before, we're tapping things like, neurological studies, we're tapping things like evolutionary biology, but also, tracking industry trends and thinking about demographic shifts. So there are a lot of components that you need to take into the pool of data gets much bigger. And I think in some cases that requires an anthropological, we need to lean on an anthropological perspective even more in pathfinding. So yeah, I think it's specifically a combination. I think the book in its goal is really to say, hey, this is not only a practice that's focused on pulling the user's POV into the company. It's also something we can use much more broadly. And there's some characteristics of ethnography that really go a long way. Things like curiosity, that's something that should be, I think, inherently part of any organization's approach to the outside world, for example. So in any case, yeah, I think pathfinding has stretched, I think has filled in some of that space, I think, between anthropology and ethnography for me.
Got it. And so, that, well, obviously very interesting. It also produces new challenges, right? The massive data, the knowledge needed to understand that data, which somewhat implies, a need for a collaborative effort, right? Other scientists who can come into the process. So can you speak of, what new challenges that's presented you, and also, if there's any really interesting opportunities that maybe I'm not thinking of?
Yeah, I think I think we benefit in some ways as ethnographers and anthropologists because in many cases if you've been in this discipline long enough, you have been dealing with a really disparate set of data. If you think about working with audio, working with video, working with observation, working with interviews, all of that really trains your mind to think flexibly about and also to think systematically about what is the value and what does each offer. So that's good, but I think that the pool of data in pathfinding also involves not only the data, but then also thinking, okay, how does a data scientist perspective, influence what it is that we're doing? How does an expert in the subject matter expert who has a very distinct and very clear understanding of their field and where it's going, but it's one vertical. So how does that play in our larger analysis? So I think the challenge becomes it's quite large in terms of trying to understand what that synthesis process looks like. Mm-hmm. And I think I spend much more time in synthesis than I ever have with the other research that I've done. I would say that it's maybe 70% of the research.
Interesting. And so how do you deal with that? Is there anything you're finding that's helpful to bring in that multivocal perspective of all these different disciplines, aside from, sort of just quoting them from for what they said and just sort of throwing them all in there? Like, how do you actually bring that together?
Well, there are a lot of tools out there. I mean, there's consequence mapping and there's horizon scanning, and I think each of them have there are other tools out there in the pathfinding / foresight space that help digest and make sense of the different sources of data, spreadsheets. But it only goes so far, as you know. I mean, one of the things that I think is really important is to get from in pathfinding to get from signal to driver. And what I mean by that is it's easy to see something that there's something there. There's some real potential here. We think this is likely to grow because it just seems to hit all of the. It resonates with different populations, with the time, with perhaps some sort of event that just happened. And then moving from that to a driver where you're saying, okay, well, what is it that's actually going to keep this so that it's sustainable? What is it? What's going to give this legs? Which is a different thing altogether, right? So sort of think about the catalysts that may be or may not be behind these signals. So some signals might be really strong, but they could easily fade to be a trend. Mm-hmm. So what are the ones that are attached to or in some way related to a driver that can move them? In many ways, that is where some of the anthropological thinking comes in as well, right? So is it touching on some basic core human needs that we feel the experience is tied so closely to that it'll help it live or help it sustain longer?
Mm-hmm. And so, the pathfinding space is, well, let's just say it's more kind of the frontier of the kind of work we're doing, in the applied space. And so how would you suggest people chart a path to get to those roles? Because again, it's, most people are not going to step into those, right? So how can, any of us, sort of lay out the road in front of us and get there?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of, I know, researchers who are out in the field who are already thinking this way and they don't know where to land that kind of insight, or it feels like it's a satellite and it's if they present it, it's a sort of a distraction. And I think that's actually, that may be true, but I think it also depends on how it's presented. So if you've got a broader insight and you have some really well substantiated POV on where you think this is going, I think it's important to bring that to your leadership in some way, and to share that and to demonstrate that, you're really not just a reporter. You're really not just, echoing what it is that users say. So I between sort of like pointing toward where you see instances like that, and also making sure that you are always demonstrating our interpretive value, right? So I think that a lot of people come to research with a lot of assumptions. We want this question answered. You can start there, right? I mean, oftentimes I think a lot of people, they're within their team, or a client comes to them and they have 20 questions. A huge way of helping them see that there's more to what we do, and also that you might work your way toward sort of a future-facing role, if you're interested, is to say, okay, well, let's make sense of these questions. Let's think about, is there a larger line of inquiry that we can be asking that would answer all 5 of these questions, right? And we're better off actually, going up a level and shifting our focus so that we can better answer your problem. That kind of strategic thinking and that kind of advice from, for a client or for a team, I think goes a long way for helping them see that you're not just echoing.
Got it. And so when in this sort of futuring space, I think there's an interesting distinction that I think there's a lot of people out there, and I'm not suggesting anthropologists, though there could be some who fall into this, but probably more coming out of like the classic business kind of consultative space. When I look around, I see a lot of people who are almost in the business of prediction, which is, pretty hard to do for obvious reasons. Whereas I think it gets back to what you said about a range of possibilities, and looking at how things may unfold versus predicting. And so do you struggle with people sort of wanting you to predict versus explaining how, the various ways that something could unfold?
Not as much. One of the advantages that I have, I think, at Facebook is that the role of a Pathfinder is, although I think there may be 5 of us in the company, but it's still people kind of know. I mean, people come to me when they think when they want that kind of a perspective in terms of identifying opportunity areas, whether it be geographic or topical or whatever. So I'm lucky enough to have a relatively informed set of stakeholders who aren't asking me to predict the future. I think I do think that's possible, and I think it's easily enough resolved rather is to really point out that that's not the business that we're in, and we're really here to help understand, point toward opportunity zones with a substantiated rationale behind it. I will say though that a lot of the work that we do often involves working with vendors, and there's a whole mix in that space, and so I think there are some folks that are, purporting to sell magic. And I think that there are others who have a truly, well substantiated and well-reasoned approach to Foresight's work.
Good. So to sort of, to kind of pivot here and tie a bow around all of this, I'd be curious to just get some input on a few things. One, I've never asked this question to anybody, but is there anything that you're reading, now, or that you would recommend reading for people who are interested in pathfinding? Because it's not, I don't think you find it per se. It's not something you find in the classic kind of literature, right? So,
yeah, I've came across this model. If you just give me a second, I can find it, but I won't be able to find it quickly. But it's called the 3 Horizons model. I do remember that. And I'm starting to explore that now, and it is really about maturity of businesses, and like if we're thinking about every business has the potential for eventual decline, and how that intersects with other businesses that are on the incline, really trying to get a better and clearer understanding of what the intersection looks like between those inclines and declines, and I think there are 3 horizons that this model presents. I'm just now starting to get into it, but I think really trying to take, it's in many ways an evolutionary perspective of the life of a business or any business, and start to think through where you might be or within your company, or where your client might be, and what's out there on the horizon that might be on the ascendant. I think it was a really valuable set of context. So I've been playing with that. I'm really also digging now into work on community. I've spent a lot of time in the past thinking about community, but I'm thinking a lot about community cohort formation and community, and also leaderless sort of. Some of my dissertation focused on leaderless cell-based communities, but sort of borrowing from some of that and thinking about how does that translate to in positive senses. When I say cell-based, I don't mean necessarily anarchists. But basically people coming together from their own, based on their own motivations, and how we can help facilitate that. So those two spaces I've been working on, thinking about.
And to the latter point, primarily for self-organization or from more of a volunteerist perspective?
Of any kind, any community of any kind. Yeah. So, it could be volunteer community, but it also could just be interest-based. And so we're trying to actually sort that out. That's a good question, because we're trying to sort out a lot of people throw the word community around, and what they really mean is identity, or they really mean a community of practice, or they mean a community of purpose. So we're really trying to get a sense of what are the distinctions there, and what are the kind of experiences that map well to those. As people start to think about community online, they're tying those together much more now, particularly because of COVID. But I think in general, that's been the case for quite a while.
Got it. Great. And obviously we've both studied anthropology. It's an anthropology podcast. Generally, everybody on here recommends anthropology. But I'm wondering if you think today anthropology is sort of sufficient to do the kind of work you're doing, or if maybe, if somebody's in a master's program right now, or even undergrad, and looking towards the future, if you think there's any value in looking broader to some kind of, sort of multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary program that brings in the type of research that we do in that perspective, but also maybe has a tech or an engineering or design component. Do you think, it's...
There's a lot to be said for interdisciplinary programs. As part of my dissertation work, I was part of the Center for Sustainable Cities at USC, and I was part of a team that included an economist, a geologist, a biologist. And anyway, it was a great experience, because it really teaches you. I think the biggest lesson that I took away from that was that each of these disciplines has their own language. And it took us, I think, a month on some projects to get to the point where when we said something that everyone else understood, and vice versa, that we were sharing a common understanding. And that goes a long way. And if you can, if you can shortcut that, that's great, because there's, one of the disadvantages of traditional anthropology programs is that they tend to focus on sort of the lone maverick anthropologists. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think that you can't do in applied settings is operate completely on your own. So I think that said, I think it's really useful. That said, anthropology as a discipline changes the way you think, I think, in some really beautiful ways. And I don't think there's any, I think I certainly have no regrets there in terms of my own deep dive in that space. The academy often is quite out of touch with the applied world. That's another issue altogether, I suppose. That's another whole podcast.
Yeah, right. You just said, when you're talking about collaboration there, one thing I would just point out is that today, many anthropologists are ending up in tech, and tech is a deep, is a domain with sort of where it requires deep knowledge in many disciplines coming together. And so, to your point that we can't work alone as the sort of the lone researcher. We really are working in a complex field, that involves engineering and design, right? And there just simply is very, there's a little chance to understand it all. I'm not saying that that's not the case elsewhere, as well as maybe doing some kind of governmental type work, as an anthropologist or what. I appreciate there's complexities everywhere, but we really are in a very fuzzy front end kind of place frequently.
Definitely, yeah. And I think, the best ways to navigate that are, I think, often, to one of the things that we're actually blessed with as ethnographers and anthropologists is you have to learn how to facilitate, right? If you've done a decent amount of ethnography, you're the stranger in someone's home, but you're also expected in many ways to lead the interaction. So you need to be a facilitator that's quite graceful in many ways. that goes a long way in terms of collaborating with teams coming from other perspectives, and making sure that you're leaving space for everyone, and that you're entertaining, treating them all as data points in some ways, right? You're entertaining all of those perspectives so you get a really holistic perspective.
Yeah. And, you said facilitator. Last thing I would just say on that is, I also don't think that we only need to be thinking about research roles, because as a facilitator, which we're trained in, we are really, we can plug into product management roles really quite well.
Yep.
And as I've talked about in various settings, you very much get to bring in the design component, the organizational component, the kind of marketing and consumer behavior component of business anthropology, and bring that all together in one role, where it's expected of you in one role, not that you're just doing it because you need to do it. Personally, I think people should consider that, but how do you feel about that suggestion?
I think it's incredibly inspiring when I see an anthropologist go into something that's not research. I think it's really cool. I've heard a lot of people talk about the way they've used, I think it might be a quote in my book as well, from an anthropologist who was working in the nonprofit space as basically a program manager. And she was talking about how she uses her anthropology every single day, trying to understand the different needs of stakeholders, and she wasn't research by any stretch, but all of the different ways she used, the ways that we're trained to think, were really inspiring to me. And I think I would like to see even more of that, actually.
Yeah, agreed. So great. So is there anything that you'd like to call attention to? Of course, I think everybody should check out, the book, Ethnographic Thinking from Method to Mindset, but, anything that you want to bring up that maybe we haven't touched on, whether that's, you just want to plug an organization or anything that you're up to.
Sure, yeah. Right now I'm co-organizing, and I think I'll be co-hosting a panel for the upcoming EPIC conference. That's Ethnographic Praxis and Industry Conference. And it'll be focusing on pathfinding at Facebook. So I think pathfinding and foresight strategy, there's sort of two titles they're very close cousins. So there'll be a panel, I think, the week before the actual full conference. So anyone who's interested should definitely join that. We'll be talking about some of these topics and diving a little deeper. And I'm working on a blog post that I've been sitting on for a long, long time, focusing on belief systems, basically, and where we are in our current moment around belief systems, and sort of this. Some of these ideas are, I guess, it's a POV on how we might handle the struggle of misinformation, but also the struggle of conspiracy theories and all the things that I don't think, certainly not the press, but in many ways, I don't think a lot of us have thought deeply enough about how to address and how to acknowledge where those the impetus for those beliefs come from.
Well, that sounds great. Definitely look forward to seeing that when it's out. So, Jay, thanks very much. Appreciate your time. It's great talking with you.
Thank you, Matt. It's been an awesome conversation, and thank you for having me.
Thank you all for listening to the Anthro to UX podcast. To learn everything you need to break into UX, visit anthro2ux.com. There you will find all the podcast episodes and career coaching resources. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.